What's up? I'm your host, Ricardo Rendes, and today we have Manuel Rosa, historian, lecturer, author of Columbus, the Untold Story, and he's written multiple books on Columbus. He has put together a lot of research to find out his true identity, who he really was, what really happened, and the amount of information that we talk about on this podcast is phenomenal. If you're a history fan, if you're Portuguese, if you're Polish, if you're Spanish, Italian, if you're we scratch the surface of all those countries and topics and their history, and we talk about the Knights Templar and just so much we talk about. So you're gonna have a lot of fun, and he definitely drops some knowledge on this show. So please also purchase the book. In our show notes on our YouTube channel, in the show description, you can find links to all our guests' work, and this will be no different. You can find on our YouTube channel this episode, and you can see the links that will take you right to the website where you can get his book, Columbus, the Untold Story, and it's just full of evidence. It's a limited edition. He's published numerous books in different languages, French, Portuguese, Spanish, but this is the first one that's published in English, and it's really important because this book really, I think, can change history, and I say can, and it hasn't yet because people haven't caught on to it yet, and I think that it's really important for us to do this. I mean, obviously being Portuguese, and he being a Portuguese historian and author, and Columbus's link to Portugal only makes this whole thing more interesting to me, more intriguing, and only motivates me more to help out Manuel with trying to get a bigger publisher to pay attention to his book, and get a big publisher to back his book and get people's attention on this book, because I think this information is so interesting. And as you listeners know, I'm a huge fan of people like Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, Gerard Williams, Thaddeus Russell, historians and people and researchers who don't mind going against the grain and going wherever the research takes them. And I know Manuel was a little worried about basically almost talking about too much information on the podcast, but I think my listeners will still support him and still purchase the book and still help spread the word and share this podcast and do all those things, because this could be one of the biggest stories of our time period. I mean, you're talking about exposing and getting to the truth and the true identity of one of the most popular, famous explorers, navigators in history, Christopher Columbus. So, and after this podcast, I have a hard time believing anybody who listens to this would believe otherwise, that Manuel hasn't reached that truth and really found his true identity. So please support the guy. His book has tons of information, so it barely scratches the surface what we talk about on this show. And I know there's a lot of international fans of the show. You know, the show's downloaded all over the world. So if you're in France, if you're in Spain, if you're in Poland, if you're wherever you are, if you're in Portugal, Italy, check out his books, and just check out if he has a book written in your language, in your native tongue, that you might enjoy and you might want to purchase. So definitely check that out. And thanks again, guys. I'll keep this short and sweet because there's so much information in this. I don't want to waste your time with a long intro. So enjoy the show. Please share this show. Couldn't be better timing. It's Columbus Day weekend, and that was kind of the purpose, was trying to get this show out for this weekend, because I thought it was such an important story, and it was awesome that we could make this happen. Unfortunately, I have a program that records our Skype conversation so you guys can see our video version of these episodes on our YouTube channel. Unfortunately, Skype was having some issues yesterday when we did this episode, so my software didn't end up recording for some reason the Skype conversation, so it'll be just an audio only show, which isn't a huge deal because I think 99% of my listeners download this stuff. Nobody really watches it on YouTube, but for anybody who does go on our YouTube channel and wants to see from time to time me and the guests visually and see us have the conversation, then I apologize. This one is just audio, but he does show things when we're talking. He was showing me pages in his book and explaining stuff that was in his book. So get the book and you can see the things that he's talking about and all the documents and pictures and stuff that's in his book. So please do that. Support this guy. I'm a huge fan. I learned a lot on this show. It's one of those shows that I'm probably gonna have to go back and re-listen just to consume all the information. And it was very enjoyable and fun guy to talk to. The conversation wasn't supposed to last hour and a half. We really didn't expect it to go much more than maybe 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour max. But he's just so full of information. The conversation was flowing. So enjoy. Remember to rate the show, share the show. If it's a show you enjoy like this one, please share it and get the word out, and rate the show on iTunes or wherever, podcast app that you listen to this podcast on, Stitcher. Subscribe to us on YouTube so you can see the video versions of all our episodes. And I think that's it. And, of course, if you want to support the show, Theory 6 Music, it's my music. All that money goes to keeping this show going. So thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one. Hey, how are you?
I see you. Hey, how are you? You see me?
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
I do. Yeah. All right, good. Hey, you got a Portugal shirt on.
I'm Português. Nestou em Chaves.
Where you from?
Chaves. That's I was born in Chaves. Yeah, I was born up north in Chaves. My parents are from well, they're not from Chaves. They're from Boticas and that area. And then I came here when I was 4. So and then we moved to the East Coast, Massachusetts, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Where?
I'm from Ludlow. Are you familiar with Ludlow?
Somerville.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I lived in Somerville, but I used to go to Ludlow all the time to the feasts, and I used to play in the band. There was a Surians. I used to play around there as well.
Oh, cool! Yeah, Ludlow has. Well, it just passed, but we had that the giant Portuguese festival we have every year at the Lady of Fatima church, and I think I read online it's like the second biggest Portuguese festival in the U.S. or something like that, or it's pretty big.
The one in Fall River, Ludlow.
Yeah, the one in Ludlow. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You never been to it?
Well, I don't remember. I mean, I've been out here for 20 years, so I've been in North Carolina for 20 years. So there's my shirt.
Yeah. So your book isn't published yet, huh? In English yet, or is it already? There it is. Okay, so that answers the question.
Limited edition.
Awesome.
So it's a small run.
It
was published by the publisher of the Polish Daily News.
And I'm guessing that the Polish are very intrigued in this story, this alternative view, because obviously the son of a Polish king, right?
That's right. It's and it's pretty much proven. Just waiting on DNA to confirm it.
Yeah.
So are you recording?
Yeah, we might as well just start it right now and keep it going. I like to kind of just keep it going that way. It keeps it casual. But thank you very much, Manuel, for being with me. I really appreciate it. I figured, I'm wearing the Portugal jacket. I figured what better day than today to wear it on the show. But yeah, thank you so much for being with me. I love alternative views on history. It's something that I'm intrigued with. I've had people on like Gerard Williams, who wrote the book Grey Wolf: The Escape of Adolf Hitler. Thaddeus Russell, who has Renegade History of the United States. Anybody who kind of has a different perspective on history, because the really interesting thing about history is that that we always say, oh, the history is written by the winners, but it's amazing how many at the same time period, how many different stories and perspectives and opinions are on the same thing. And this is a perfect example of it, because with Columbus Day right around the corner, I figure, I actually ran into your work not too long ago, and I don't even know how I ran into it, but I think I was researching some stuff, and then I ran into your work, and then I found out that he was born in Portugal, which was a alternative, theory that I've never heard of, and I looked more into it, and I saw some of your interviews, and I'm like, wow, I'm like, this guy really has a lot of information to back this up. And it's amazing when you end up going down that rabbit hole, how it's like, it's almost accidental, but if you don't, there's all this good information out there and this alternative view that you might never run into. And, you know, same thing with Gerard Williams. When I had him on, I remember when I first ran into his book, he wrote a book about Hitler not dying in Germany and making it to Argentina. And at first it seemed like such a really ridiculous theory. I'm like, oh, that's insane, because I've never heard anybody question this. And then you see all the books that are written in Argentina about him being there, all the research that Gerard did. I mean, he was a part of doing a DNA test on the skull, which proved that it wasn't Hitler's skull that they found in Germany. There's literally no proof that the official story is actually the real story. And
well, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's been written and taken as fact when actually it's written with the purpose to hide the truth, to hide the facts. And that's really what I found with the story of Columbus. You know, we have a story that's been propped up by hearsay and not really by facts. And you know, you're referring to it as an alternative history, but actually what comes down to is that my research actually points to the correct history, whereas the Italian Columbus was the alternative history.
Yeah, well,
so what we have, you know, is documentation step by step on how the history was false from the beginning, how it was written based on hearsay and on false information, and then how documents were actually forged to support that false history so that the truth could remain hidden.
Yeah, and that's when I say alternative theory or alternative history, I think, you know, I don't want people to confuse the fact that I don't mean that it's any less, or really, I mean, you're right, that's almost a bad term. What I mean by alternative, I mean alternative from the story that we're taught, the mainstream story, alternative from that story. And it's amazing how this, I mean, people are going to celebrate this guy's, you know, he's given his day, people are going to celebrate this guy, celebrate his story, and none of it seems to be accurate at all. And for people, I guess for people who aren't that familiar, I mean, he was apparently or supposedly born in Italy, poor, you know, went to I mean, I guess in the official story he did spend time in Portugal, so that part is somewhat accurate. And then went to
what happens with the history that we were taught is that this guy was a peasant, he was a weaver's son, and spent the first his childhood in his early teens carding wool and weaving wool, and then got interested in navigation, and then somehow at 25 years old ended up in Portugal from a shipwreck, and then went on to become the famous person that we know that sailed in 1492 for the Spanish and went on to discover America. In fact, that whole story is full of holes. There's no documentation that ties the guy who discovered America to the guy who was living in Italy. And what it comes down to is actually two different people. The guy who discovered America, the guy who we call Columbus, was actually called Colon, C-O-L-O-N, like colon, semicolon. And the guy who discovered America, or I should say who sailed in 1492, because America's already discovered, and he already knew where he was going because he was traveling with secret information provided to him by the King of Portugal. But the guy who sailed in 1492 was a guy who could read and write in Portuguese, who could read and write in Spanish, could read and write in Latin, who knew cartography, geography, algebra, geometry, I mean, all kinds of different sciences, and who had been schooled from a very young age. And the guy from Italy was a peasant who would not have been taught those things. But to look at things in a logical sense, if you take the current history where you grow up in Italy and you live there, you know, until you're 14 or 15 years old, and you start sailing, and you show up in Portugal at 25 years old, your mother tongue is going to be Italian, whatever they spoke in Genoa. Well, the guy who discovered America, the guy who sailed in 1492, never wrote a single letter in Italian. Not even to his brothers, who are supposed to also be Italian, not even to guys from Italy, not even to the Bank of St. George in Italy. He wrote in Spanish with Portuguese words mixed in. So that right there has got to make everybody stop and wonder. You know, if a guy was born in Italy, lived there for 20 years, why could he not read and write in Italian? Not even to his brothers and to other Italians. And these are some of the things that started to get me questioning about the story. But the main fact that got me really that made me doubt the story was when I learned that the guy who discovered America was married to a noble Portuguese lady in 1479. So in 1479, the guy who we call Columbus, whose name was Colón, married a lady who was so high up in Portuguese society. She was daughter of the captain of the island of Porto Santo in Portugal, in Madeira. She lived in the Monastery of All Saints, which was a commandery of the Military Order of Santiago. So the Military Order of Santiago was one of the elite clubs of the Portuguese Knights. There were 4 elite clubs in Portugal: the Templar Knights, which was the Order of Christ. There was the Order of Avis, which King John I was master of. There was the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, which we call Crato in Portugal. And there was the Order of Santiago. So those 4 elite clubs that the Knights belonged to were very elite. You had to be, you had to be indicted into these orders, and you had to have a lot of connections. And once you got into these clubs, you got even more connections. You can compare it to the country clubs of today, So for this lady to marry anybody, the King of Portugal had to authorize her marriage, mainly because the master of the Order of Santiago was King John II of Portugal. And by the rules of Santiago, the rules stated any of the lady members can marry if they request authorization from the master. So for this lady to marry the guy who discovered America, the master had to authorize their marriage in 1479. Well, it's impossible to accept that this lady, that the king would have authorized this lady to marry a peasant wool weaver who just washed ashore 2 years before, without having ever gone to school, without having money, without having the job, without having the ship, anything that the official history tells us that the guy washed ashore from a shipwreck and he was a peasant. That would never happen. That would happen today in a Walt Disney film, but it would not happen in 1479 in medieval society. Even today, it's very difficult to happen in Portugal that a peasant, a poor foreigner comes to Portugal and marries anybody of any substance in Portugal. He'll marry another peasant. Well, and that's how I started to unravel all this.
Yeah, well, that's true, because you look at monarchies that we still have in the UK. I mean, who they marry is a huge deal. I mean, the royal family, who they marry.
Right.
So people can kind of relate that to, and this is now, which people have become more modern, and they don't take the king and queen as seriously as they did at that time, which was, it sounds completely unrealistic, the idea that a peasant would marry into a prestigious family, somebody with money and stuff like that. So,
right, and you have to realize that the noble families, they made alliances, and marriages were not, a person could fall in love with someone, they could not marry them without the family authorizing it. There were cases of people getting killed, kidnapped, put in jail for marrying without the family authorizing them. Noble marrying another noble. There was a case of the widow of the brother of the captain of Madeira. Her husband died. She married another noble guy who her brother-in-laws didn't think was good enough for her, and they arrested her and put her in jail. That's the kind of stuff that was going on, and you could not come to Portugal out of nowhere, be a nobody and marry a somebody. That would never happen. And that's how I started to unravel all this. After 10 years of research, I realized the whole history was false. The name was false. Columbus, he never called himself Columbus, he was called Colón. The identity was false. He was not a peasant, but a noble person. The voyage was false. He never set off to look for India, but to make the Spanish believe that America was India. And he was never working for the Spanish. He was always working for the King of Portugal, because he was a secret agent for the King of Portugal.
Okay, and now, yeah, and that's what your book is about. I mean, that's the part that really got my attention, because being Portuguese, and that's the thing in America, you don't learn much, if any, really Western European history. And never mind, I'm glad I probably didn't pay attention in school, because I would have had to relearn everything instead of learning things correctly, doing my own research. But that's what really got my attention, was the fact that even I, who was born in Portugal. Obviously, I spent most of my life here, but my parents grew up there. I have family that grew up there. I've been to Portugal numerous of times growing up, and I've never once heard this story. I remember talking to somebody. We have a family-owned construction company, and I was talking to a guy who works for me who grew up in Portugal, and I was telling him about you being on the podcast, and because being Portuguese, he might be intrigued in it, and he's like, I've never heard that. He's like, in school in Portugal, they taught us that he went to school in Portugal, but he's like, I've never heard any other link to Portugal besides that.
Okay, let me stop you right there. He went to school in Portugal. Now imagine this: it's the 1400s. There are no public schools. Okay, a foreigner comes to Portugal at 25 years old, and he goes to school.
Yeah.
That is just mind-boggling that any historian would have even written that. You go to a foreign country, you go to work to support yourself. You don't go to school. Even if there were public schools, you still would not be going to school at 25 years old, and without having a way to support yourself. So that's part of the myth that's been written and repeated over and over, and that makes the current Columbus history completely devoid of common sense. Well,
that's the thing. We're just told this information, and we just accept it because we're being told by somebody who has a PhD, and we don't ever ask any questions. And I think that's a huge issue. What's his name? John Anthony West, he does all this alternative theories and history on Egypt, and all these professors and historians fight him on it. Graham Hancock's another one. Just all these people, where there's a huge issue with people who have this certificate on a wall that says they're an expert of this story. Now you come around and you change that story. Now they're not an expert anymore, and people will automatically fight that. It's amazing how you figure.
Oh yeah, this is my first book. This was published in Portugal in 2006. The Columbus Mystery Revealed. This book has almost 700 pages. Okay, this is full of documents and translation of documents. Because when I put the book out, I wanted the public to read the evidence that's out there. Because if you read the evidence, you'll make up your own mind that the history was false. And when I published this book, the historians in Portugal, instead of saying, wow, we should go read this book because, it might be something interesting, they actually opened a blog to attack my book without reading it.
Wow.
And when readers would come online to the blog and say, listen, Manuel Rosa says such and such, what do you have to say? They would attack me as being a quack, as not knowing what I'm talking about, and they would ask, but have you read the book? And they would write back, no, we have not read the book. Then the readers would say, how can you criticize a book you have not read? And they wrote basically like this: you don't have to read the book to be able to criticize it. You just need to know the subject. And
Absolutely.
That's the battle that I have been fighting for 10 years now. On the other hand, when this book came out, the Professor Joaquim Veríssimo Serrão, who used to be the former dean of the University of Lisbon, and who's written about 20 volumes of the history of Portugal, and who was also the president of the Portuguese Academy of History for like 30 years. He wrote me a letter, typewritten, the old typewriters, and signed. And basically it said, Mr. Rosa, I read your book, and then I reread your book. And I have to say, I'm 100% in agreement with you. And he went on to write the preface for my second book. Okay? And basically, that's a picture of me with him there. And basically what happens is that every academic that has read my book has either praised it or has come out with doubts about the current history and about the official history. And the reason that they that they only have doubts instead of certainties that the history is false is because they have not gone back to check the documents that they base their history on. because once they do that, like I've done, they will completely throw the history out of the books, because that history of the Italian Columbus is completely false. There's not one document that connects the guy in Portugal to the guy in Italy. There are, on the other hand, lots of forged documents in Italy that try to connect the guy from Italy to the guy in Portugal. So, and once you realize that that there's 3 or 4 key documents that are forged, the history is false. Not only the fact that he could not speak Italian, that he never called Italy his homeland, the fact that he married this lady, the fact that he spoke and wrote in Portuguese, but the fact that when he came back from the first voyage in 1493, he returned to Europe. He went to Lisbon. He did not go to Spain. He went to Lisbon. He met with the King of Portugal for a week before he went to Spain. And while he's in Portugal, he wrote to Queen Isabel and King Fernando a letter saying how he had returned, and basically he made this statement: "Remember, Your Highnesses, that I left wife and children, and I came from my homeland to serve you." You see, the only place that he had wife and children and lived was Portugal. That's the only time in all his writings, in all his, hundreds of letters that he left behind and things, he notes and things, that's the only time where he comes close to admitting where he was from. And so he kept his whole identity secret, not because he was a peasant like the historians have written, not because the kings did not know who he was, because that's another fallacy in the history. The historians wrote, this guy was a peasant who made himself pass for a nobleman. And he hid his real identity because he did not want anybody to know he was a peasant. Okay? That shows how little the historians know of those times. If you were a noble and you showed up in a new kingdom where you're not known and you say, I'm a nobleman, the first thing they would ask you is, what is your lineage? Who are your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and all that. And then they would write back to that kingdom. For instance, if you say, I have a coat of arms, they would write back to that kingdom and they would say, give me the genealogy of this person and tell me what the coat of arms is. And that master of arms, they call him the king, Rei de Armas. I forget what it's called now in English. But anyway, the guy who keeps track of all the genealogy and the coat of arms would write back to the new kingdom and say, yes, this is the guy's genealogy. Then that person would present that genealogy in the new kingdom, and they would accept him as a noble. Okay? That's how it worked. If you were a peasant and you showed up in the new kingdom and say, I'm a nobleman, and you could not prove you were a nobleman, you would never have been accepted as being a nobleman. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when he goes, so he's married in Portugal to this very noble lady who the king authorized the marriage. So the king had to know who he was. The king has not authorized this elite woman. Columbus's wife was so elite that her nephew was the king's Lord Chamberlain. He ran the court for the King of Portugal. Okay. Her father was married 4 times, so she had some half siblings. Her half-sister's cousin was the king's mistress. Her half-sister's aunt raised the king's children. Okay? 3 of her nieces married. 1 married the marquis. The other 2 married counts. Okay? The marquis that one of them married was from the house of Bragança. Okay? John of Bragança. Very elite family in Portugal. So we're talking about a family, a wife that is so connected to the court of Portugal that she's in the inner circle. Her family is in the inner circle. Let me tell you more. Columbus's father-in-law, the captain of the island of Porto Santo, was Bartolomeu Perestrello. Bartolomeu Perestrello was a knight of the house of Prince Henry the Navigator. Lots of people have heard of Prince Henry the Navigator. But what they don't know is that Prince Henry the Navigator was the Templar master of the world. Some people do not realize that when the Templar Knights were outlawed and arrested in 1307, the Templar Knights did not go extinct. In Portugal, they were never arrested. And in Portugal, they would simply change their name to the Order of Christ. The Order of Christ. You got the cross on your shirt right now.
Yep.
I got the cross
On the boat.
on my
Yeah.
okay. The Order of Christ was the Templar Knights, except instead of being an international organization, it was now a national organization. And the Templar master at the time, from 1420 till 1460, was Prince Henry the Navigator. So what this means is that Columbus's father-in-law was a Templar Knight. Okay? And he was a knight of Prince Henry the Navigator, of the household of Prince Henry the Navigator. This is how well connected Columbus was. Furthermore, when Columbus is in Spain, the King of Portugal wrote him a letter in 1488, a secret letter, that calls him Cristobal Colon, our special friend in Seville. The king calls him ingenious, industrious, very necessary to the court of Portugal, and the king wanted him to come to Portugal right away for some secret dealings. And the king wrote in the letter, and don't worry, whatever is owed you, you will be paid, that you will be very happy. Okay? So this is the guy who everybody said the King of Portugal hated, and who hated the King of Portugal, you see? In fact, they were in collusion to fool the world, and they fooled the world. They did not only fool the world at that time, but they have fooled the world for 500 years. And until now, until Columbus, the Untold Story came out, they have succeeded in fooling the world. And this story would not have been unraveled if, I'm going to say, if I did not unravel it. Because you had to have a lot of skills to be able to get to the point I got. First of all, you had to have been intrigued by the story that he was married to a noble lady in Portugal. A peasant could not do that, and you know, be inquisitive enough to start digging into the stuff. And when I started digging, it took me 10 years. The current story is so well cemented that it took me 10 years to be able to you know, to be able to get to the point where I can say, okay, the whole history is false. Okay? And then it took me another 10 years almost to really get to the point where I could present a history that is more correct to what happened. It took me 10 years just to get to the point where I could definitely say the history is false. Okay? One, because the name was not Columbus, it was Colon, and the Italians corrupted the name in 1493 from Colon to Colombo. You see? And then that letter was published all over the world with the wrong name. And everybody outside of Portugal and Spain knew him as Colombo. You see? Only in Portugal and Spain, they knew him as Colon. Now, if you go to any Spanish-speaking country, they're going to call him Cristobal Colon. They never call him Colombo or Columbus. Okay? So the name was corrupted to Colombo in Italy in 1493. It was spread all over the world as the wrong name. Sorry, but they still... Can you hear them talk?
I just barely hear them. So it's all right. Yeah, it's not that loud.
I'll tell you. They're right outside behind me.
Yeah, it's all right. I had one time my wife had to go to work, and it was a later podcast, and she works at a restaurant. And we had my son, and I completely lost track of time. We ended up doing like a 2.5 hour podcast, and all of a sudden I see her next to me holding my son, like, "Hey, I gotta go." So then I'm like, "Well, what do I?" So and then I put him on my lap, and then I was talking to the guest, and it was hilarious. He grabbed the microphone, and you know, I think that's what people like about podcasts is that.
Well, yeah, that's okay, but no.
The casualness.
Okay. But I'm trying to make you know some important points here, and I don't want the people listening going, what are they saying in the background?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Yeah.
So let's start over. So the guy. So one of the points that make the history false, one of the facts that make the history false, is that the name was Colon, not Columbus or Colombo. The Italians corrupted the name from Colon to Colombo in 1493. That letter was then published all over the known world, in France, in Germany, you know, in the Netherlands. And that letter carried the wrong name. So everyone outside of Portugal and Spain learned that the name of the guy who discovered America was Columbus, when in fact it was Colon and Colombo. And if you go to any Spanish-speaking country today, they call him Colon. They don't call him Colombo or Columbus. They call him by the name that he was known by when he was alive. And This is, I don't know if you heard a few months ago that there was a letter at the Library of Congress from Columbus that had been stolen from a museum in Italy, had been sold in the U.S.
No, I didn't hear
Anyway, that letter was returned back to Italy. So basically, it's a copy of this letter, and this is the letter that spread the wrong name. So this letter, like I said, was printed in 1493, March or April of 1493, and from that year on, we have known the guy who discovered. We have known Cologne by the wrong name. And so that's one of the pieces of the puzzle to try to solve this, because we have been looking for a Colombo and a Columbus for 500 years. Well, the guy's name was not Colombo or Columbus. Okay? The other piece is that he was hiding his identity in Spain, not because he was a peasant, because like I said before, a peasant could not show up somewhere and pass for a nobleman. When Cologne went to Spain in 1485, the end of 1484, he was housed at the house of a duke for 2 years. Okay? You don't get hosted by a duke for 2 years if they don't know who you are. So this is the kind of stuff that logically you can debunk the current history logically with just these facts. That if you show up in a new country, you're not going to be hosted by a high nobleman in the area if they don't know who you are. If you're a peasant, they're going to put you in a barn somewhere. The other piece of this is that the Duke of Medina Sidonia, which was the richest and the most powerful duke in Spain, wanted to marry his daughter to Columbus's son. You see? And there was a battle between the King Fernando of Spain and the Duke of Medina Sidonia for Columbus's son. In the end, King Fernando won the battle and he married Columbus's son to the king's own cousin. So in what alternative world would a peasant's son marry the king's sister? You understand? That never would happen. It's just not how things worked back then. So to kind of wrap this up.
Wrap it up, yeah.
Right. So basically, what we have a false history based on false documents. And then, I say false documents because there's a last will that's attributed to Columbus, which was forged by the Colombos in Italy 80 years after Columbus died to try to steal his inheritance in Spain.
Yeah, I read that today that you sent me. Yeah.
And this last will is what the historians say, well, Columbus himself says he was born in Italy. Well, they never went to look at the document. Like I told you, it took me 10 years to show that the history was false. Every time I read the documents and everything back, went over them again, I said, this guy was not Italian. The history is false. And then I said, well, but he wrote in his last will that he's from Genoa. How am I going to explain that? And I would call some historians up and university professors and try to debate this with them. And they would say, no, he was from Genoa. He said so in his last will. And then I'd go back. I said, I must have missed something. Go back, review everything again, and then come out again. This guy's not from Italy. He doesn't speak Italian. He's married in Portugal. He reads Portuguese and all these things. He never talks about anything about Italy in any of his documents. The only time he tried to write a short Italian note in Italian, he could not even say "I" in Italian. He wrote "I" in Spanish. That's how Italian he was.
Well, to be the devil's advocate, if he was a Portuguese spy, wouldn't he do a better job of trying to present himself as an Italian? If that's what what's your opinion on why you think that he did such a poor job doing that?
Right. So let's think about this logically. He could not present himself as an Italian because when he went to Spain, they knew who he was, right? They knew who he was because you don't host a person in your home, in a duke's home. You're not a special guest in a high nobleman's house if they don't know who the special guest is. The other part of it is that when Columbus went away to Spain, his nephew, a guy who was married to his wife's niece, basically was the Count of Pernambuco, also ran away to Spain at the same time because it was a traitor of King John, and King John was going to kill him. And this is really why this whole mission, why Columbus went to Spain as a secret agent. That's that whole treason that was taking place, and this is why Columbus was infiltrated in Spain by the King of Portugal. But anyway, when he goes to Spain, he goes with his cousin. I mean, his nephew and his nephew's family. His nephew's family is hosted by the Queen. The Queen makes this guy a governor of some provinces in Spain. Makes Columbus's nephew governor of some provinces in Spain. So if Columbus is there going, hey, I'm an Italian guy, you see, his nephew would have said, Your Highness, watch out for this guy. He's lying to you. You understand? In other words, they knew who he was. This is why as soon as he gets to Spain, they house him in the Duke's home. The Queen starts giving him stipends, and things like that would never happen if they did not know who he was and if he was not noble. But when I get back to this point where I was saying that this last will, was a problem for me to be able to affirm 100% that the history was false. And so I started to say, well, maybe he was lying in his last will. He was lying to cover up, for some reason he was lying, saying he was Italian. So I said, well, I have to go to, I read transcriptions of the last will in Spanish, in Portuguese, in English, in French, and, trying to find some mistake of the people who were copying the last will, and they all pretty much said the same thing. So I said, I have to go to Spain and look at this document. So I flew to Seville, and I went to the Archive of Indies, which is where the stuff is housed, and I asked them to bring us so I could look at it. And the minute I looked at it, I knew it was a forgery.
How'd you know?
And I explained that in my book, but I know it for two very, very simple reasons. One is the first word on the document says traslado, copy. Okay? It's a copy. It's not an original. And then at the bottom, it's signed by Columbus. Okay? But it says copy of a last will of the deceased admiral. Okay? If he's deceased, how is he signing the document?
It's how do they ignore that? How do historians ignore that?
Well, because they never saw the document. Now the other thing is that any document like that, if he really had written that document, and this was a copy, it would have had to have a notary signature at the bottom saying, yes, this is a real copy of the original, and I've signed, I'm affirming that this is a real copy of the original. Well, what happens? As I dig more and more into this document, I find out it was presented in an inheritance lawsuit in the late 1500s by these Italian Colombos who were trying to steal the inheritance from Columbus's real descendants. And when this Italian Colombo presented this false last will in court, the Spanish judges said, this thing is worth as much as a blank piece of paper. Get out of here. Okay? That blank piece of paper is what is sustaining the current history by the current historians.
Wow. So these Italians were trying to get the money, but the money was actually given to who? Columbus
descendants. Yeah.
So his real family. There was, because obviously there's a lot of
right. So it was a lawsuit. Basically the lawsuit, the Italians had no business coming in to try to steal this anyway, because Columbus had lots of descendants. He had great grandchildren and great grandchildren. He had about a couple of hundred that were alive and living in Spain and in the New World. And any one of those had a better claim than anybody from Italy.
Do you think they knew? Did they know the truth? You think?
Who?
His family, who he really was and his real history and all that stuff.
I think that some people in his family knew who he really was, and they kept the secret because they had to keep the secret. But not everybody knew. So it was restricted to on a need-to-know basis. Let's put it that way. So what happens is that this lawsuit lasted 30 years. For his inheritance. In other words, to figure out which descendant was really the next one in line to inherit all this money and the posts of admiral and viceroy and all these things that Columbus had. And so in 30 years, a lot of manipulation was done, you know, false documents and cheating and lying and killing and backstabbing. And these Colombos were just another part of that deception that was going on to try to steal the money. So in the end, the person who actually won the lawsuit was a descendant of the King of Portugal. He was married to, so Columbus's granddaughter married a Portuguese nobleman, a Portuguese royal, and his grandson ended up inheriting Columbus's inheritance in posts and titles in 1609. So, you know, there was a lot of manipulation of things going on. But to get back to the you know, how things can get out of hand pretty quickly. You know, we have a guy who's got a false identity when he goes to Spain, who the kings knew who he was, Isabel knew who he was, the King of Portugal knew who he was, but they helped to hide his identity. Because of that, the stuff that's written about him and his genealogy and where he comes from is intentionally false, because they're helping him hide who he really is. And then when 80 years after he dies, there's this big lawsuit going on where people come in and manipulate the facts for their own benefit. Everything starts falling apart. The manipulation becomes the history, you know, and that's the documents that we are using, you know, 400 years later to write history. And it just so happens they found the Cristoforo Colombo in Italy, and they said, well, this must be the guy, you know, and then they make the history fit that guy, even though the history does not fit. And when things did not fit, they invent the solution. So basically they say, well, Columbus never wrote in Italian to anybody. Well, that's because he was a wool weaver. He never went to school in Italy. He only learned to read and write in Portugal, and that's why Portuguese is the basis for all of his writing. You know, and we accept that as if that's fact. And then we ask ourselves logically, how many immigrants do you know that come to a new country at 25 years old and take on the country's language as their mother tongue so well that whenever they talk to somebody else, they, you know, they completely lose their original tongue, language they spoke for 25 years. Never. Hasn't happened with anybody. You know, not only that, you know, if he came to this new world, came to Portugal at 25 years old, as they say, and he started to learn Portuguese, you know, and that was the first language that he learned. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, got that out to go back.
yeah, that's okay. Well, I had a couple for people who are listening who don't. So we keep talking about him being a Portuguese spy, but we're not really getting to why would Portugal want him to be a spy in Spain? Why would Spain fund him? All this stuff. And, you know, that's kind of a, you know, for people who are listening, you know, because basically at that time, Portugal and Spain didn't have a very good relationship because, I mean, Portugal and Spain have been fighting for a long time. Spain has trying to take over Portugal. Well, it was a part of Portugal. It was all one country at one time, a part of Spain. And then they tried to get their independence a bunch of times. And so they didn't have a good relationship, right? And so this is basically...
That's right.
So this is the reason why...
So basically what happens is we have, you know, the Portugal... you know, Portugal was declared independence from Castile and Leon, you know, which was used to belong to Castile and Leon, the part of the territory up where Porto is. But then the kings of Portugal conquered the rest of it down to the Algarve from the Muslims who had invaded those Christian territories, and that reconquering, you know, did not belong to Spain, to Castile. Only the original part up in the northern part of Portugal belonged. It was part of the Castilian kingdom. But yes, that's true. For 400 years or so, Spain had been fighting Portugal to try to take it back, you know, and Portugal had been fighting for its independence. And so, so in all of Europe, Portugal had only one enemy. It was Spain. Portugal had friendly relations with all the other kingdoms. In other words, the oldest treaty in the world is a treaty between England and Portugal from the 1200s.
Yep.
You know, a trade treaty. Okay.
Still active today, right?
Yeah. It's still active, but hasn't
Yeah.
England hasn't lived up to its part of the bargain.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's
what else is new? Yeah.
But that's what we have to keep in mind is that Portugal had created alliances with every kingdom in Europe, and they only had one enemy. It was Spain. And Spain for 400 years had been fighting Portugal, trying to take it over, and Portugal had been fighting to maintain its independence. So that's that's the status quo that we have to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about Portugal and Spain. The other thing is that the main reason that Columbus was sent to Spain as a secret agent, it was to take the Spanish ships in Spanish and to focus Spain on the territory across the Atlantic, give them somewhere to go, fight and conquer, and leave the Portuguese alone so that Portuguese could keep trading in Africa and eventually trade in the spice trade in India. Now, I explain all that in very great detail in the book. I'm not going to get into it here. But let me just tell you the reason that started this whole conspiracy as to why the King of Portugal, felt the need to send Columbus to Spain as his secret agent. Queen Isabel tried to kill the King of Portugal in 1483, 1484, using Columbus's nephews. I told you a little while ago that the Count of Pernambuco ran away to Spain at the same time with Columbus. Columbus married to Columbus' wife's niece. That count was part of the conspirators who were trying to kill the King of Portugal at the request of the Queen of Spain. Okay? The reason she wanted to kill the King of Portugal is because she had signed a treaty with the King of Portugal that forbade the Spanish from sailing south of the Canaries. Okay? They could not sail to the ivory trade, the gold trade, the slave trade, and whatever fish. They could not even fish in the seas south of the Canaries. And she wanted to nullify that treaty. And because the King of Portugal had some traders of his who wanted to kill him, they went to her and they said, "Listen, if you give us aid to kill the king, we'll become king, and we will nullify the treaty. And then you guys can go trade, in Elmina and Ghana, which is where they had the gold trade." And Isabel assisted them in, was aiding them in trying to kill the King of Portugal. When the king found out, of course, he killed most of them. A lot of them ran away, and this is how Columbus ends up in Spain. So they run away to Spain because that was, who they were working with. And Columbus is infiltrated with the traders at that time, with the mission to take them somewhere else to go and entertain themselves.
So
and that's what
deflect their attention from going to the same routes that Portugal was, so Portugal could basically reap the benefits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. So Portugal knew the New World was here for a long time. Okay, not only Portugal, but the Danish knew, the English knew. This territory of Canada had been, visited thousands of times. For 1,000 years before Columbus sailed across. So it's not that Columbus came to discover. Columbus came to make believe he was discovering and make it known to the Spanish that this world was here. In this way, the Spanish had some place to go and entertain themselves, and the Portuguese could be left alone in Africa and India. And the result of Columbus's voyage was that right away, the King of Portugal forced Spain into a new treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Okay, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world north-south in half. It kept Brazil on the Portuguese side, and India and Africa on the Portuguese side, and the Spanish kept everything to the west of that line. And basically, as soon as the king had forced Spain into that treaty, which everybody says the Pope divided the world. No, the Pope wrote something saying, "Hey, Spain will keep everything 100 leagues west of the Azores, and everybody else stay out of there." And if Portugal had agreed with that, they would have said, "Fine, let the Pope decide." That's not what happened. The King of Portugal forced Spain into a treaty, exactly the way he wanted the treaty to be, and he marked the line where he wanted the line to be, the line of division, and that line included Brazil on the Portuguese side because the Portuguese already knew Brazil was there, and Columbus is the person who tells us the King of Portugal already knew Brazil was there. Okay, so I explain all that in my book. So as soon as Portugal has that treaty signed where it prevents Spain from sailing to India, the King of Portugal orders Vasco da Gama to prepare for the voyage to India. Okay, and that was Columbus's role. His role was to make the Spanish believe that America was India, so Portugal could force them into this treaty, preventing them to go from going to the real India. And that's that, and a lot more stuff is all explained.
Yeah.
Columbus' Untold Story, and it's now told. So you can buy it at columbus-book.com.
Yeah, I'll put all the links in the show notes.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, even at that time, the King of Portugal had laws where you couldn't talk to foreigners about navigation and stuff, right?
Yes, at penalty of death. If you talk to foreigners about any of the new discoveries that were taking place, any maps, anything like that, any of the secrets of trade, anything that had to do with ocean and navigation, and even selling caravels or going to another kingdom to build one, there was laws against that.
And this was trying to keep the information from Spain?
From Spain and from everybody else, really.
Yeah.
So they even though they were friendly with Italy and France, they had treaties with France, with Denmark, with the King of Denmark, the Netherlands. They had treaties with those guys. They still didn't want the information to get out, because if the information got out, they would lose their upper hand. So they had a penalty. They had a law that was a penalty of death for anyone who gave information on the discoveries to a foreigner. And at the same time, we got Columbus next door trying to give Spain information, and he's never persecuted. He's never killed. He's even helped. He's helped in his mission to sail across the Atlantic.
And what's crazy is that the official story is so wrong that he actually never even makes it to America, right? He goes to Haiti, and then
he made it to Central America.
Oh, Central America. Okay.
So he was on land in Central America, but never to what is the United States. Well, I shouldn't say never. So I believe he sailed, the coast of Florida and those other things, but he did it secretly. So he was sailing. After he discovered the New World, after he discovered Haiti, and he built the colony over there, he actually went off sailing on discovery lots of times. He was at sea for months at a time, and it only took a month to sail across the Atlantic. So if he's at sea for months at a time in a new world, he's discovering a lot of territory. But he's keeping it secret because his mission was not really to aid Spain. It was to aid himself in Portugal. And the reason I say he discovered Florida is that in 1500, the guy who was the master of the Santa Maria on the first voyage, Juan de la Cosa, actually made a map of the New World that shows Florida in 1500, But that's not the only secret Portugal kept. Australia was discovered in 1522 by a nephew of Columbus's father-in-law, Cristóvão Mendonça. 1522. It was kept secret by the Portuguese for 200 years.
Wow.
Okay? So the proof of that is in Peter Trickett's book, Beyond Capricorn. So basically, there were some maps out there. I believe they're in the library in some museum in Los Angeles or California. And these two pieces of this map, were put together. They took these two pieces of maps and they put them together. And some Australian guy was at the museum and says, wait a minute, if you take these two pieces and you turn them this way, this is the coast of Australia, And indeed, that's what it is.
Wow.
1552.
Yeah,
okay.
Graham Hancock in his book, The Fingerprints of the Gods, he talks about that too, I believe, like older maps and how civilization could be older than we ever believed it was.
It was.
Yeah, if you've never read his stuff, you might be very interested in it. He just came out with a new one recently. I can't remember the title, but Graham Hancock, Fingerprints of the Gods was his original, and he was same thing, known as a quack, no information. Now, as he does more research and more, official historians, because if you don't have that PhD, people don't take you seriously.
Right.
Now people are taking him seriously, and he's he has other experts on board and traveling to Egypt, and he's debating a lot of and even I remember him even talking about the Azores, the pyramid that they found there. That's did you hear about that? The pyramid that was underwater off the coast of the
Well, I
Azores?
heard about that, but I've never seen any. I have never seen any real images of it. So I'm not sure that pyramid actually exists. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff that is going on that we don't know because, first of all, you cannot write about everything. That's one thing. The other thing is that in the old days, people are not interested in writing when they found something new. If you sailed to Canada, you went fishing. If you sailed out there and you went fishing and you got all the way to Canada, they found some new land, and you came back and you tell your friends, hey, I had some new land over there. They're not going to send out a press release. It was not how it worked. Now, the other thing is that we should keep in mind is that Iceland was already in Ptolemy's map in the year 150. Okay, Iceland. So if they could get to Iceland by the year 150, why would it take us, 2,000 years to get to Canada? It's just incredible. Now they just found a Viking burial ground in April this year. A Viking burial ground at Stony Point, New York, a few miles north of Manhattan, from the 9th century. Okay? So what we don't know is immense. We know very little of what went on.
Oh, absolutely.
But, I started to tell you earlier about why I was the only person who could do this. I wouldn't say I was the only person who could do this. Anyone else who knew Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, Italian, could have done this, but they would have had to want to do it. First of all, they would have had to say, okay, there's something fishy in this story. Let me try to figure out what's going on. They would have had to spend 10 years going through all this research and documents and, all this stuff to get to the point where they're convinced, hey, the history was false. Then they would have had to spend time trying to figure out what the actual history was and to piece all this stuff together. And it's 25 years now that I've been dealing with this. And even though I've shown the history is false, and I've shown really what happened, what Columbus knew, what the king of Portugal was up to, and how the whole thing was a conspiracy against Spain, I think I've uncovered his real identity, and I have enough evidence in the book that my theory will be the accepted theory, okay, of who Columbus was. Now, that can be proven with DNA, and once enough people read the book, once there's enough public pressure to force the authorities in Santo Domingo and in Poland and other places to do new DNA tests, because we had DNA tests done in 2003, 2004 with the bones in Spain, which I was involved with that study. Those tests were flawed because they wanted to prove something instead of finding out what the truth was. You see, Spain wanted to prove that the bones of Columbus were in Seville and that Columbus was a Colon from Barcelona. And their study was done really to try to get to that point with that theory in mind, to try to prove that theory. Whereas my philosophy is, let's get forensic scientists together, let's get at Columbus's bones in Santo Domingo and his brothers and sons and grandsons, and let's try to find out what the truth is. I believe I have the truth of who Columbus was.
Well,
he was Sigismundo Henriques, born on the island of Madeira. He was son of a king of Poland who was living there in self-exile under a secret identity. Now, I believe Columbus was Sigismundo Henriques, son of the king of Poland, and I have all the evidence in my book that proves that.
Because some people argue with you the fact that the king of Poland died, right, and he couldn't have been in Madeira, right, and that was I guess an argument people bring up to you.
That is, but you see, that's where they're being false in their assertion. Anybody that tells you the king died in 1444, November 10, 1444, in the battle of the Christians against the Turks, against the Muslims in Varna, Bulgaria, in 1444, the next question is, was there a body recovered? Right? No, there was no body. Did anybody see the king die? No, nobody saw the king die. Did anybody identify the guy who the Muslims killed when they said they killed the king as the king? No, in fact, when they saw the head of the guy, they said, no, that's not the king. Okay? How can you say the king died then? You can only say the king disappeared. That's all you can say. The king of Poland disappeared in battle when he was 20 years old. Okay? Now, is there evidence he survived? Yes. There's evidence right a few weeks later that he survived, because the Duke of Bosnia wrote to I think it was to the Holy Roman Emperor that the king was alive. Okay, and there's been things, you know, in other years further years down the road where they say the king is alive. Not only that, there was a letter written from Portugal to the Teutonic Knights in Poland that basically says, the king of Poland is alive, he's living in an island of Portugal, and I'm his companion. Okay? This letter was just found after the Second World War in the archives of the Teutonic Knights. Now, what do historians say when they are confronted with this evidence? Well, they say, that letter is a forgery. And I say to myself, really? You don't present anything. You don't present a single piece of evidence that the letter is a forgery. You don't say that it. You know, the letters remain secret for almost 600 years. Nobody used it for anything. Why would someone forge a letter and hide it in an archive and never use it? You know, if you're going to forge a letter, you can use it for something. The other part is Count Rosmital from Bohemia. He was brother of the Queen of Bohemia. Came on a diplomatic mission to Spain and Portugal. Okay, and while he was traveling through Spain, he met a hermit who people said was the king of Poland. And so they went looking for this guy, and they recognized him as the king of Poland because they made him take off his shoes, and he had 6 toes. And you want to know the funniest thing I've read about the people who deny the king survived? Was a lady who wrote exactly mentioning my book and saying how my theory does not hold up because the king died. And she said, this hermit that I saw in Spain was actually a fake who the Teutonic Knights had sent over there to trick Count Rosmital into accepting that the king was alive for some political purpose, right? And then you stop and you say, okay, where would the Teutonic Knights find a guy with 6 toes to go play a fake hermit? Right?
Yeah,
that's many around, right?
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, when you put it's almost like all the pieces are there, but nobody connects the dots. And they need somebody like you who gets intrigued with the story and maybe borderline obsessed with the story to look into it. And like you were saying, you made a really good point about testing the bones. I think a huge issue is, I mean, one, I think science and history and intellectuals, they do have a dogma, and I think they like to believe that they look at the evidence, then they have an opinion. But the truth is, many of them have an opinion and then look for the evidence that back that, and that's a huge issue. And and I'm sure that's probably something you run into a lot, where people are ignoring some piece of evidence that conflicts with their story or their proposed story.
That's right.
Yeah. So I mean, it's you see it over and over again. I mean, in school we're still teaching kids that Christopher Columbus found America. We're still teaching kids that, I mean, we're still calling the native Indians, which is it's just hilarious. And I mean,
kids that Columbus was the first person to think the world was round, which is not true at all. Ptolemy already said the world was round on the year 150, and before that, 500 years before him, a guy from Marseille had already written that the world was round. So, and Columbus himself says, I always read that the world was round, so, so we got all these fake things. But let me show you one quick thing here. Basically what we have here is a sword. See this sword?
Yeah.
This sword was found in the 1800s, buried about 5 miles from the battlefield of Varna, where the king supposedly died. That is the king's sword.
Which, if they killed him, they would have kept, right?
Of course, a sword doesn't walk 5 miles from a battlefield. Not only that, exactly, if they had killed him, all this stuff would have been stolen from him. His armor, his sword, his rings, whatever he had, the sword would not have walked away. So basically what happened is that the king buried the sword because it had his coat of arms on there, and he would have been, the sword would betray who he was. He had to ditch it, in order to be able to escape clandestinely from the battlefield. So anyway, that sword is the first time that's ever seen in any book. That's kept at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And, it was found in Varna, where the king disappeared. It's got the coat of arms of the King of Poland.
That's amazing. It's crazy the research you did. And I mean, you should be teaching history or doing a history podcast or something. I mean,
well, I'm hoping that someday, like I said, that this book will be picked up by a major publisher who can put it in every store in the United States so people can read. And once this reaches critical mass, the history books will change. We will do new rounds of DNA tests. We will test Columbus's DNA with the kings of Poland, and we will prove that I am right. But I'll give you one final piece of evidence that I am right. So the name Cologne that this guy assumed for himself when he went to Spain, he said, I took on, as his son said, my father chose the name Cologne for 3 reasons. One, because in Greek, the name Cologne means member. The word Cologne means member, so we get our colon, semicolon from. Because it's the ancient form of his noble ancestry, the name of his ancestors, and because the name Cristobal Colon together described the mission he was about to go to embark in, which is Christ going member. So basically, his name was Christ going member. That's what it was. It was a definition of what he was about to do. So he chose to call himself Christ going member. So, and his son also wrote that, he had that their ancestor was a very famous Roman general, who was the trunk of this Cologne, House of Cologne. Well, so it turns out that the Colonna family in Italy descends from a very noble Roman general who was uncle to Julius Caesar, married to Julius Caesar's aunt, Caio Mario. Well, in 1424, Pope Martin V, who was Otto Colonna, Martin V was from the Colonna family, wrote to the person who I say is Columbus's grandfather, and basically said, you and I are relatives, descendants from the same house of Colonna. And that's how we'll leave it. Read Columbus, The Untold Story, for all the rest of the facts.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna definitely do my best to advertise this book. Obviously, being a fellow Portuguese, it's always nice to support one another. And I have actually a couple other shows that friends of mine who've been on the show who might be interested in having you on as a guest. Who have a pretty good fan base. Okay. That I'll throw out the name to them and see if they're interested in it, because this is right down their alley. And it's interesting because if you like conspiracy, if you like spy stories, if you like history, if you're Polish, if you're Portuguese, if you're American, you'll be intrigued with the story. And
you just like to know the truth, to find out the truth. You should read the book. I mean, it's everything I've told you is documented. Everything I've said. There's footnotes in the book. Anybody can go and look and see where these documents are. Everything I have said is documented down through the ages, and it was an untold story, but now it's told.
It's told,
Columbus, yeah. The untold story.
I mean, have you always been intrigued with history, or is this the first?
No.
Really?
I really did not care what happened in the past. I was one of those people like, hey, who cares about that? That's yesterday. Let me worry or concentrate today on what I'm doing tomorrow. But like I said, in 1991, I was working on a translation of a Portuguese book into English because 1992 was the 500th anniversary of the discovery. And I was working on the translation of this book on Columbus from Portuguese into English, and I read Columbus was married to this captain's daughter. And I said, wait a minute, something is not right here. I came from Portugal. I know that the poor could not even talk to the rich girls, and not even when I grew up anywhere, where your family grew up, same thing. If you were a poor farmer, you had no chance to marry anybody's daughter that owned anything. If you even tried to talk to her, you get a boot in the ass.
Yeah.
So that would never happen. Even when I was growing up. That's how I got interested. I said they either have the wrong wife or the wrong husband, and that's how I came to this. And I started to tell you earlier something about when a person comes. I told you about how immigrants, how they say Columbus learned to read and write at 25 years old in Portugal. When there were no public schools. And one thing that people miss and have missed is that there were no public schools. You could not go learn to read and write. You know how many people are still illiterate in the world today? My grandfather could not even write his own name. He signed with an X.
Oh, my parents. I mean, my parents. They grew up on a little farm. My mom's from Subradelu, and it was a small little village. And they got once they got to a certain age where to go to the next grade, you had to leave the village or leave that vicinity. Right. They had the choice. Do you continue?
All they had was fourth grade. When I grew up, when I grew up was the first year that we had fifth grade in Portugal. But what I'm telling you is that before, in medieval times, there were no public schools. The poor could not go to school, and you certainly did not go to school at 25 years old. And if you were in a foreign country, no matter who you are, at 25 years old, you are not going to learn the language of your new country in 8 years, which is what they allow Columbus to learn Portuguese, to the point that it replaces your mother tongue. Maybe if you came to Portugal at 1 year old or 2 years old or 4 like you, your English is going to replace Portuguese because Portuguese never got rooted in you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't dream in Portuguese. If somebody's...
But your parents, if they came over when they were adults, English will never replace their Portuguese.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's what they want us to accept that Columbus did. That Portuguese replaces Italian when he spent only 8 years in Portugal, according to the official history, and he only learned to read and write at 25 years old. What kind of Walt Disney fairy tale is that?
Well, they should find out what language he swore in, because usually you swear in the language you're most comfortable in.
Well, I'll tell you, he always swore by Saint Fernando.
Huh.
That's what his son said. My father always swore by Saint Fernando. Well, there was only one Saint Fernando in the world at that time. It was the brother of Prince Henry the Navigator, who died in prison in Morocco in 1443. And the Moors, the Arabs, pronounced him a saint after he died. Okay? So these are all things that are, that I can explain, that I explain in my book, because one, I'm able to get at this information because I can read Portuguese, and two, I want to get at the information, because if you read a statement like that, the Columbus' son wrote about his father. He was a modest man. He never swore, and when he swore, he swore by Saint Fernando. You're like, well, why? Why not my mother's soul, or on or I swear by God, or I swear by Santiago, or by Saint George, which is the patron of Genoa. Why Saint Fernando? Well, because Saint Fernando was very important to him. He was someone who was fighting against the Moors, like his father had fought in Varna against Islam. He died. He was a Portuguese hero at the time that Columbus, a little bit after Columbus, before Columbus was born. So the cult of Saint Fernando was just coming along at that time. Everyone who was venerating this new saint, the new Portuguese saint. He was a martyr, and so that's all these little pieces, that we start putting together. All the ties are in Portugal. They don't go anywhere else.
Yeah, that's so interesting. People need to get this book, and I'm so happy to hear that it's published, because I've seen some past interviews, and you were talking about how how you haven't yet. You've published in other languages, in Portuguese and Spanish and stuff, but you haven't published it yet in English. So
Right.
now that you have at least a limited edition, and you haven't got it yet up on Amazon or anything like that yet?
Well, Columbus-book.com is where you should go to buy the book.
Yeah, that way.
Because that's direct from the publisher. So this book was published by Outwater Media Group. They published the Polish Daily News out of New York and New Jersey. And so, it's like I said, it's a limited edition. There's about half of it is sold already. So once these are sold, there's probably not going to be another edition unless a major publisher picks it up. So, I'm hoping that eventually, Penguin or, someone out there will publish this and get it into the major, into the market, in a major way.
I mean, it seems like a book that would want to get picked up. I mean, it's a book about possibly the most popular, famous navigator explorer of all time, and it's exposing the fact that everything we've been told about him could be possibly bullshit. So it is. Not possibly. Yeah, it is. And so that's. I mean, the fact that, and again, Christopher Columbus is. I mean, you can get the person who paid the least attention in school, and they would know the name Christopher Columbus. They would know no other navigators. They would know no other explorers, but they would know Christopher Columbus. So you're talking about somebody who's that famous, but yet, the fact that this book wouldn't pick up a publisher immediately is insane to me. I mean, I'm going to go on your website and order a book probably tonight. Order a copy.
So what happened? I'll tell you. When I first discovered all this stuff in 2005, I had my manuscript for the Columbus Mystery Revealed, which I was at the time calling Unmasking Columbus. I had my manuscript for this all written. Like I told you, 700 pages, and I said, "Wow, the publishers are going to be fighting each other to publish this book." It took me. I could not get a publisher in the U.S., which is why I wanted to publish it for the 2006, which is the 500th anniversary of Columbus's death, which is why I translated it to Portuguese and had it published in Portugal. But it's been completely counter what I imagined would happen, and part of the reason is that there really is no way. Well, part of the reason is that the media has not picked this up and made it, a mass news all over the world, because once they do that, the publishers will get it, will learn of it and get interested. It's very difficult to talk to a publisher in the U.S. You can't talk to any publisher. You got to get an agent, and then the agents don't want to talk to you because your name is not Dan Brown.
Yeah.
And so it's not easy, but eventually I believe that this will get a major publisher, and it will change history.
Well, I'm gonna do my best.
And my banner says the book that changes history.
Yeah, and it does literally. So I'm definitely gonna do my best to spread the word. I think I love stories like this. I have a huge issue with the fact that people mold the I guess the perspective of history they want to suit whatever agenda they might have or propaganda they might have, and it's to me it's really important to share these stories and really get the truth out, and I that word, it's one of those words that you don't like using too much because there's so many conflicting opinions and stuff like that, but when there's that much information, and I mean not just that, I mean even if you ignore the evidence you have, the evidence that contradicts or actually explains that the official story or the mainstream story is accurate, there seems to be no evidence. So it's amazing that this story can continue on, being told and told again.
The official story has no common sense to it at all.
Yeah.
So like I said, everything that I have told you here is documented somewhere in some document, in some archive, in somewhere that other people can go and verify. I have not invented anything, and so the thing is, they have to read the book. If they read the book, they'll make up their own minds, because basically what I'm showing in the book is evidence.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to do my best to put this out there. I know my listeners love this type of stuff. I have a lot of historians that piss off academics and because because there's this group think, there's this dogma that, anytime you go against the grain on what is mainstream or what is taught in school, you don't really get, and really if you don't have, I don't know if you have a PhD, if you're an official historian, but even Dan Carlin, who's been on my show, and he has this one of the most popular podcasts in the world called Hardcore History, and it's a history podcast. He doesn't have any. He never got a PhD. He never, he's not a official.
I don't like that.
Yeah, but that's my point.
I fell into this by accident. Like I said, I wanted to know first from my own curiosity, and then I found out that the history was wrong.
Yeah, but if I listen to you know as much as you know and talk about history, I mean. To me, you're a historian. I mean, you're I'm a historian. You're a historian. I mean,
a historian is not necessarily someone who has a PhD. A historian is someone who
studies history,
who researches history, and who can put the facts together and tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So which is what I've done. Now, the funny thing is, like I told you, 10 years ago, the historians in Portugal opened a blog to attack me. Now, what the historians in Portugal are writing, I have a guy who just wrote a book not too long ago, which I actually quote in my book, professor at the University of Lisbon, and basically he says, without that the history of Columbus is correct, that's how it's coming out. It took 10 years, but so they now are doubting.
It's taking time, but it's happening. Yeah. I mean, sometimes.
And the reason he doubts it is because a peasant could not marry a noble lady.
Yeah, which seems like the most obvious.
That's the result of the books that I have published in Portugal. Because I showed who Columbus's wife was. Nobody knew who she was before I came along. When they knew she was daughter of this guy, of this captain of island of Porto Santo. But everyone missed a very important piece of evidence that was left. And that was that Columbus' son said, my mother lived in the monastery of All Saints in Portugal, in Lisbon, Santo Velho. I don't know if you've been to Lisbon. Santo Velho is the French embassy today. Santo Velho was the commandery, the female commandery of the Order of Santiago. What does that mean? That means that commandery, a commandery is a organization that owns territories that they live off of the rents of those territories. She was one of 12 elite ladies that were allowed to live there off the rents of those properties. Okay, and nobody realized that when his son said, "My father's wife was a commendadora in the All Saints monastery," they should have known right away. She was a member of the military Order of Santiago. But, they never put that together. They always assumed she was some, nobody, meaningless in Portugal, And those are the kinds of things that I had to fight to present in Portugal, because nobody really cared about Columbus in Portugal. As a matter of fact, they despised him in Portugal because they assumed he was an idiot, But now that they realized he was actually a genius, and it was actually working for the King of Portugal, and that everything he did was to fool the Spanish, which made them, the reason they think he was an idiot was actually an act that he was putting on to fool the Spanish, with claiming that America was India.
Yeah.
And now, wait a minute, now this makes some sense,
And actually, the true story then if once the true story is exposed and accepted, then I feel like he deserves his own day, because this guy obviously did something pretty crazy. I mean, he tricked a country, kept them entertained while Portugal was reaping the benefits of Africa and India.
The world for 500 years. Okay, everything he did was so well planned you cannot imagine. Okay, he said that the Santa Maria sank. In off of the coast of Haiti. In fact, it never sank. He put the ship on shore, he shot it with a cannon to disable it, and he left behind the only two people that could have gone to court with him to let the Queen know that this was not India. Okay? Everything was so well planned. It was just done like he was a genius in the mission that he was entrusted with. He was the James Bond of his day.
Absolutely.
And he pulled the mission off flawlessly.
Yeah, it's well, yeah. I mean, we're in 2016, and people still believe basically the fake story that was put
Yeah.
together. Yeah, I mean, it's
Gave the
unbelievable.
Spanish. He gave the Spanish wrong coordinates for the places. He gave them false information about how much gold was here and all that. He gave him false information about the ship sinking. He gave him false information that he had conquered a city when it was just 10 grass huts. I mean, everything was false. But that was his mission. That's the reason he was in Spain.
Unbelievable. I can't wait to upload this podcast and get it out there. And once I do, I'll send you the links, and feel free to post it anywhere you want on your website, anywhere you would like to post the interview. This stuff is out there. I do this, and I try to get the information out as much as possible. I love these stories that really provoke thought and make you rethink what you thought you knew, and that's absolutely what your book does. Your research is amazing, and I don't know how you consume and hold all this information. It's the names and dates and links to each other, and how you connect the dots is
well. I've gone over this material for 25 years over and over. Because
a lot of practice.
You have to understand. I'm not just writing a book. I'm trying to answer things for myself. Because things just, it makes sense. I find a clue here, I find something there, and I'm like, how do these things fit? I spent, I knew he was lying to the Spanish, right? And I spent, when he gave him the wrong coordinates and all that, and I spent months trying to figure out, how do I prove that he knew exactly where he was sailing, and that he was lying when he gives him these coordinates for the Cuba is 42 degrees north, pretty much where New York is, and all these different things. I'm like, how do I prove that this guy knows what he's talking about, but he's lying to them? And then one day it came to me. He came here, he discovered the New World, he went back to Spain, and then when he was in Spain, they sent him back right away to come in with 17 ships to come and claim establish a fort, a place to protect it from anybody else. But his brother was living at the court of the King of France. Imagine that, another peasant living in another court. His brother was living at the court of France. And he wrote to his brother, says, "Look, come quickly because, I came back and I'm going to be leaving, for you to come with me." But when his brother got to Spain, Columbus had already left. So Columbus left his brother an envelope with secret information. Take a ship and meet me in Haiti. And his brother, never having gone to Haiti, followed Columbus' directions and went directly to Haiti. Okay?
And suppose it got lost and found his way back, right?
Right. But I'm saying, you understand what I'm telling you? His brother had never been to Haiti. But he followed Columbus' directions, and he went straight to Haiti. This means that Columbus gave his brother the correct information. All the other stuff that he's given to the Spanish that doesn't make any sense is misinformation, and it was intentional.
Oh, wow! There's so much evidence that it's mind blowing that this isn't, like you said. I mean, this should be the top story on the weekend of Columbus Day, that everything we were taught has been nonsense, and it's been
yes, exactly, it's nonsense,
and backed up by nothing.
They assumed he was lost when in fact he was fooling everybody else with false information.
Yeah, that's unbelievable, and it's funny because I remember seeing you in an interview where there's an Italian American who kept arguing, like, oh, the Italians, it's all these great things and like almost taking it personally, taking it personally. And it's like, well, this isn't about him being Italian this is just about exposing the truth. And the fact that it's not a blow to Italians or Spaniards or the Portuguese or whoever. It's about getting the information out, connecting the dots. This is what truly happened. And it's not taking anything away from, obviously, the Italians and the Spaniards and all the Portuguese explorers who obviously had huge influence all over the world. But, it's almost like he was taking it personally. Like, and I wonder, seeing that interview, it made me think, like, I wonder how many Spanish people, Spaniards from Spain or Italians who maybe will fight this information just for the basic fact that they want the story that we've been told to be the true story, because it gives their country or gives their people a little bit of credit.
Like like the Spanish don't want to know that we're not going to want to accept that their queen was fooled, into accepting this was India intentionally. In the long run, it worked out well for them, But the other thing is that Vespucci, who you must have heard of, was actually an agent of Columbus from 1495 on. He worked for Columbus. Okay.
So he was also an agent?
Yes. Nothing that happened was by accident, So, the giving the name of Vespucci to America was unjust, But they couldn't have given Columbus's real name anyway, They couldn't have called it Enriquia,
Unbelievable. I mean, people have to get this book. Obviously, there's a limited amount, but at least spark the conversation, and hopefully we do get we're at some help to get a big publisher to publish this book.
If anybody has anyone that a publisher, contacted a publisher, they should let them know about this, because once this limited edition is over, there's not going to be a reprint. I don't want another limited edition. I want something, that's a major publication.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll do my best to help you out with that. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about podcasts, is that anybody that I find interesting, anybody that I think has an interesting book or documentary or does some interesting work, I can have them on, and I don't have any guidelines on who I can or cannot have on. And
okay.
And that's a nice thing about this. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about the internet, is that we live in a world where we have the freedom to do this. It's the one spot where people can put out stuff without being worried about being censored or having an agenda or whatever. And one thing that people have learned from listening to my show is that I don't have any agenda, and my opinions are constantly changing, because as new information comes in, I'm constantly remolding myself and rethinking what I believe, or what I thought I believed. And this book and your information will absolutely do that with everything that I thought I knew about Columbus. I mean, I knew that. Obviously, I went from thinking he was an idiot to thinking that he was a genius, overnight. So it's very interesting.
That was pretty surprising for me as well, is finding out that he knew exactly what he was doing at every step of the way. He planned everything very well. He fooled everybody else on the voyage, and he was the only one who had the correct information. So it's you'll see all that in the book. And one more thing I'll show you. This is the cover of the book, as you probably can see over there.
Yeah.
So you see this guy taking the mask off.
Yeah.
That's because this is what Columbus looked like.
He looks much more Polish in that picture.
Those two pictures there.
Yeah.
Those two pictures are painted by Spanish artists that worked at the Spanish court. One of those pictures was painted by an artist who died in 1504. And the other guy started painting in 1505. And both those pictures are exactly how Columbus' son described his father. My father had reddish blonde hair. He was light-skinned that turned bright red in the sun. He had light eyes, and he had a pointy nose. The guy that we know as Columbus, the picture that you see of this guy with the three-pointed hat thing, was actually of some Italian guy who someone wrote Christopher Columbus, painting of Christopher Columbus, and it was not even painted as a portrait of Columbus. Wow. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum now, it says "Portrait of a Man." It doesn't say Columbus anymore.
Huh. Wow. I mean, it seems endless. I mean, you must have.
The whole history was false. Everything.
I could imagine you in a room, going through this stuff, and you're finding these pieces, and you're probably in a room by yourself, going, "I can't believe what I'm finding. This is. I mean, you probably feel like you're an investigative journalist, and you're finding the pieces, and I could just imagine the excitement as more and more stuff just build it up.
When you read the book, you will find that portrait I showed you of one of those portraits has secret codes written in it intentionally that lead to Columbus's identity.
Wow. Well, all great stuff. I definitely, one thing I love about these shows is that my listeners don't just learn something and grow from it, but I learn stuff and I grow from it. And I definitely learn a lot. This is one of those shows I might have to go back and re-listen just so I can digest everything that. Yeah, or get the book. Yes, yeah. I actually, it is true. You can. It seems like when you read something, you hold information a little better than when you're quickly going through stuff online. But yeah, thank you so much, Manuel. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to be on.
You invited me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll definitely do my best to spread the word. Like I said, I've had other friends I've made in this realm of podcasting. I'm actually very surprised. I was looking for other interviews that you've done on other podcasts. I was very surprised that more people haven't picked up on you and invited you on. But I'm definitely, I have a couple shows in mind that I think would be very interested in your book and your research and the information. So I mean, anything I can do to help to kind of spread the word, I definitely will. So thank you so much.
And everybody can go to columbus-book.com and buy the book that's changing history.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, it is. It's definitely changing. Well, or at least the history that we were told. It's rewriting it, and so thank you so much. Yeah, and keep in touch.
You're welcome.
It sounds like I should have you on to do a whole show on Portugal's history, because that's.
Oh, you're gonna find a lot of information in this book you cannot imagine involving the Temple Knights.
Yeah.
So anyway.
It seems like, well, that's the thing. It seems like the book will intrigue all these different types of people: Polish people, Portuguese people who are interested in the Knights Templar and how their influence in Portugal. Anybody who's Spanish, Italian, American, like
you're going to find some surprising stuff about Portugal and the Templar Knights in the book. So
awesome. I can't wait to order mine. And so definitely check that out. Go to the website, guys. As I'll put links in the show notes, like I always do, and or you guys can just Google Manuel Rosa or the Columbus Untold Story. You'll find it. I end up finding it pretty easily. So definitely check it out and support the guy and start telling people this Columbus weekend. Because this is a great conversation starter for this weekend. If you're at a barbecue and you bring this up, this is going to be a long conversation of people being like, what? Very surprised of the information. So thank you so much, Manuel. I really appreciate your research is phenomenal.
But I won't even tell you about the false globe that was built in Germany to support Columbus's theory in helping fool Spain. Yeah. So you'll read about that in the book.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, Manuel. Have a good night and keep in touch. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Believe in the ripple effect.